67% of American adults play some sort of video game once in a while. It all started in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when arcade games were being pumped out left and right. This garnered an audience of young kids and teenagers to spend hours and lots of quarters in arcades. And arcades, at a time, proved to be one of the best spots for people to hang out.
Come on in. It's almost another world here in the video arcades of America. 1 billion games are played every month, a quarter each for escape, which can last a long time if you're skilled.
Yet with the advent of video game home consoles coming onto the scene, the need to go to a place to play a video game became antiquated, as the convenience could be found within your living room. By the late 1980s, arcades were dying out, and the 90s rolled around with only a handful of notable arcades left. The arcade, a dimly lit, loud, crowded, and overstimulating arena of bright lights and video games, was once the place to be. And the culture it created, as well as the vibes it gave off, seemed almost exclusive to the era in which it thrived. It was a product of a bygone era, memory of what once was as video games advanced in graphics and capabilities. Except, they came back. Those 7-year-olds playing Pac-Man in the arcades back in the 80s are now 40 or so years old. And as you grow older, the things that interest you change. You get into more mature markets, notably casinos and bars. And this was a trend companies began to pick up on. By the 2010s, arcades were making a comeback in the form of arcade bars, of which there are many. Tapping into a market that combines the enjoyment of adulthood with the fun of nostalgia brought arcades back, especially during an era where there was a rise in normalizing and accepting nerd culture. Nostalgia was no longer just a word, it was a selling point. Dave & Buster's, Apex, Round 1. All of these arcades combine these elements to create a unique gaming experience for adults, teens, and children. Yet for as great as the comeback was, there was perhaps a lapse in authenticity. Whatever happened to arcades that prided themselves on just being arcades? Arcades that were just for amusement and nothing more. Well, no, don't get me wrong, there are dozens of arcades just like that all over the place. Some of them even surviving from the original days of their inception. But in modern day, would there ever be a company that would try to make a chain of vintage-styled, truly retro arcades? The answer is both yes and no. Created, developed, owned, and shut down by the king of retro himself. This is the story of the short-lived modern-day classic arcade chain, Pac-Man Zone. The earliest trace of a Pac-Man Zone being opened is around 2019 in December, found in Michigan. But obviously development had to start earlier than that. Arcade juggernaut Namco, now called Bandai Namco, has certainly evolved from the days of the arcade. With new genres of games under their belts produced specifically for consoles, they have come a long way from 8-bit spaceships. But unlike many gaming companies who focus solely on the future, Bandai Namco knows its history. They are not afraid to look back on their arcade classics and continuously release collections of their iconic games from the past for basically any console that exists. And in a modern-day world where retro is cool and 8-bit is admired and appreciated, Bandai Namco saw the chance to reinvent the wheel. Back in the 90s and early 2000s, there were many Namco-owned arcades. You could usually tell because their name would be plastered somewhere and a giant Pac-Man of some kind was to be found. They had their own tokens as well, ones with an embossed Pac-Man on them. In my youth, I had the luxury of experiencing one of these, but like all good things, the joy doesn't always last forever, and the arcade closed. But Namco was willing to take another stab at the idea of an arcade and lean into that retro aesthetic. Their icon of choice? Pac-Man. A solid idea. Everyone knows who Pac-Man is. The parents, grandparents, children, all over the world, Pac-Man has a global recognition. And while he may not be as active as in yesteryear, he is still very much alive in our culture. Thus began the creation of Pac-Man Zone, a classic-styled arcade. Pac-Man Zone locations began to spring up all across malls in America, a timed release with one opening up and another following a few months after. Many locations were planned, and locations that had the chance to open did financially well. While not the first, I'm happy to say that one of the earliest locations in its first year of operation was one not too far from where I lived. So from here on, you're going to see footage of my own experience going to this arcade. Pac-Man Zone never intended to break the mold. Most locations were noticeably small in size, but that was the intention. A low-stakes, low-key kind of arcade, never intending to compete with arcade bars, but offer a fun and family-friendly experience. As you can see, the decor is truly what made this arcade stand out from the rest. It was truly decorated in Pac-Man fashion, with maze walls, hanging ghost plushes, vintage-styled arcade cabinets, Pac-Man-related redemption prizes, and of course, a giant Pac-Man statue that greets you as you walk in. But the place was not just a Pac-Man heaven. The arcade offered many different modern and best-selling arcade games, ones you would find at the bigger arcade bar locations, combining a nice mix of old and new. So what exactly happened? Hindsight is 2020. Completely unforeseen, many of these Pac-Man Zone locations opened up just months before the year 2020. Just months before the coronavirus pandemic, which took over the entire world globally. We all lived through it, so it goes without saying that there was a brief time where no stores were open for months. And even when that rule was lifted, many stores did not have the money to reopen for a while, because owning a location requires a company to pay for renting the space. And when a location is closed for such a prolonged period of time, a severe lack of income soon follows. This unfortunately resulted in many small businesses closing, as they simply could not cover the costs. By the summer of 2020, I remember visiting the Pac-Man Zone arcade and only noticing one worker inside and a few of the arcade cabinets missing. My friends and I had asked the employee, and we discovered that Bandai Namco had given word to Pac-Man Zone employees that they were pulling the plug on the chain of arcades due to financial loss. The arcades were still allowed to be open on a mall-by-mall basis, but all Pac-Man and Namco branding had to be stripped, destroyed, and as for our nice Pac-Man statue, sent back to Bandai Namco. And this truly took me by surprise. Every single company lost money during the pandemic, but every company, I'm sure, was hoping to bounce back once lockdowns were lifted. But it seems just as the lift began, Bandai Namco did not want to risk it and ceased operation of the very arcades that they created. Namco abandoned the arcades they created without even giving them a chance. I can say, for example, that my local Pac-Man Zone opened up in February of 2020, and the world shut down in March of 2020. By the summer of 2020, Pac-Man Zone was no more. I think making videos like these are very important in the history of video game preservation, as well as their history. The time in which these arcades began to open was during a time absolutely no one could have foreseen coming. The future looked golden and came to a crashing halt. Because of that, we missed out on something truly special. Maybe not grand in scale, or even something to go beyond the US and Canada perhaps, but it was something a bit more sentimental. A tiny little interactive love letter to a bygone era of video entertainment, branded entirely with the very character who pioneered it all. But that was then, and this is now.